Today on Chasing Leviathan, we pursue the big question, how can we best protect personal data in the digital world? My guest is Dr. David Norton, Clinical Assistant Professor in Marketing Logistics at Ohio State University. We discuss his study, The Bulletproof Glass Effect, on the effect of privacy notices on consumer confidence, and I learn what makes people trust companies more. So please, come have a seat with us and learn to listen with me. The study that we're kind of discussing today is the Bulletproof Glass Effect, unintended consequences of privacy notices. And so before we launch into like discussing that, I'd love to know, how did you get interested in your current career path? How did you say, you know what, I want to study marketing? Tell us a little bit about Professor David Norton.
Yeah, well, that's a interesting question. In some ways, yeah, it was sort of I had no better options. Maybe I was So I guess how far back do you want to go? I grew up in Texas, so when I was in high school, I was always kind of a creative person, and so I thought maybe I want to go do advertising. Creating new interesting things. And now I guess the sort of interesting thing about that is that I really hate it when my students essentially equate marketing to advertising, because it's so much more. I mean, marketing is so much more beyond advertising. But I was, I can empathize. I was in their shoes. So I was looking at schools and trying to figure out where to go. And UT Austin was just down the road. A really highly thought of school. Their business school was really well ranked, I think, at the time. And so I just sort of showed up. I seemed to do okay on test scores, the board scores, SAT. If that's what I think it was the SAT back then. They did it on paper and with pencils. That tells you how long ago that was. So I did okay, and so maybe mistakenly they let me into the program there at UT Austin, and managed to find my way out of that program, and so what really kind of interested me in that program was the marketing research classes. I graduated from my undergrad right after September 11th, and so jobs were pretty scarce. So a lot of people wanted to put you in jobs that weren't all that palatable. They weren't all that interesting. And so I went, and the classes that I found interesting were the data science classes and marketing research. So my dad was a statistician, so that probably helped along the way. I like to say that I was kind of a perfect blend of my mom was a psychologist and my dad's a statistician. So that's kind of how I fell
You were
into it.
doomed from the start. Yes.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. You can imagine dinner table conversations, some poorer dinner table conversations. I got a D in statistics, the very first stats class I took. And my dad was not very happy about that.
Man.
So I got into marketing research and found it sort of fascinating to be able to ask people questions. And I worked in the marketing research industry for a little while, worked at a variety of firms, and I eventually had difficulty in having a boss. Maybe you can relate. I didn't really like being told what to do all the time. And I also got tired of sort of the tedious nature of doing studies over and over and over again. And so for me, the PhD seemed like an avenue for freedom. So I could sort of think creatively about interesting questions that I thought were interesting, rather than, how satisfied are you with the service at such and such restaurant or bank or whatever.
Gotcha.
So I went down and started pursuing a PhD at South Carolina in Columbia. and that's kind of where I started getting interested in identity.
Mm.
So that's kind of my area of expertise, if you will, if I'm
Sure.
allowed to say I'm an
Yeah.
expert in something.
You have a PhD. I think that counts. Yeah.
Okay, well, fair enough. Um, I would say that I know some PhDs that maybe aren't experts, and I don't know. I shouldn't say that. Maybe they.
I mean, yeah, there is that. There's the truth, and then there's being polite, right? That's fair.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I started looking into. I'm fascinated by consumers. I would probably classify myself as a consumer psychologist. Um, and just how people think and how people behave as consumers and given different contexts and how they process information. And so most of the stuff I work on is about identity and identity formation. I'm fascinated because it took me a long time to kind of figure out who I was as a person. And so yeah, I think that's kind of a lot of, and I think if you talk to a lot of academics, especially psychologists, they'll say that a lot of their work is autobiographical. They like to study things about themselves to try to be introspective and figure out who they are as a person. So yeah, and I study consumers and how they express or not express their identity, and privacy is sort of one of those non-expressions of your identity or the control of your own information and identity. And so that's kind of how we got into thinking about privacy.
So tell me a little bit more, and that's a great segue there about how you connected with Dr. John, Dr. Bruff, and I believe, and I'm going to say her name wrong, Shripa, soon to be Dr.
Yeah,
Shripa.
Shannon.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
So
how did this whole study come to be? Like, where did that start?
oddly enough, maybe it's not all that odd. It started as a conversation. So I've known Aaron. Aaron was a PhD student at Northwestern University while I was a PhD student at South Carolina. And one of the ways that we could pay for conferences was to volunteer, checking people in and registering people at these conferences. And so both Aaron and I were volunteering at a conference. I can't remember. I think it might have San Francisco or something like that. But basically, because we're cheap and underpaid as PhD students typically are, and so we got an admission to a conference there, and so that's how I met Aaron. And so we've been friends for some time. That was probably a good 15 years ago. And Aaron's an amazing researcher, and I have the utmost respect for him. And at a conference maybe a couple of years ago, we were talking about various projects as we do. What are you interested in? What are you working on? Those kinds of things. And I had mentioned, being interested in a project that I was working on, but I wasn't making much progress. And he said, "Oh, that sounds really similar to this project. This is the Bulletproof Glass project that he had started with Leslie John some time ago. And I had made some progress and had several studies done, but they kind of, as a lot of projects, their lifespan, sometimes they wax and wane. Sometimes that you get really excited about them and you make a lot of progress. And then sometimes you just run up against either issues that the direction that you think it's going to happen just doesn't take hold. Or other things take priority. Other projects that are maybe more exciting take priority. And so we were talking about this, and he asked if I'd like to join their project. So I'm kind of the interloper here. I just kind of joined the project late, and I read through the paper, and it was really interesting. And I ran a few studies myself here at Ohio State, and kind of jump started it again. I guess we put the little electric paddles on the project, and its heart started back up again. And then we started. We all kind of got simultaneously more interested about the project, and so then we decided to continue it and ultimately finished it. So
awesome. And so for our listeners, do you mind just summarizing the project? Because I found it really fascinating. And I think I'm glad to hear that you cover the psychology of it, because it is one of those fascinating, and I think there's good reason for it, but the fact that when we see more protection, we often actually causes us to worry more. So,
Yeah, right. And
go ahead.
that's the genesis of really of the title, right? The title is the bulletproof glass effect, and so I think that probably comes from Aaron, the the title. But it's essentially a very apt analogy that when we, the whole point of bulletproof glass is that it's supposed to be protective,
Right.
right? It's supposed to make us feel more secure. But then when we see it, when we encounter it, it's a little surprising. It's not like we walk around all day, at least not here in the U.S. Uh, seeing bulletproof glass all the time, or seeing gates that are barring parking lots and other things. And so when you see that cue, it kind of raises our the salience that there is danger potentially. And so what wasn't necessarily there beforehand sort of comes to light. Now we start to think about potential dangers, and now we're consequently feel less safe overall. So it's this very ironic kind of situation where you see bulletproof glass, and now I feel less safe because of that, right? And so essentially, to give you a quick summary of our paper is essentially about data privacy and consumers. And so we talk about privacy policies, or I think the term we use is privacy notices. So these are, if a firm has a privacy notice that says this is all the ways that we either protect or use your data. In many cases, those are now legally required, mandated to have. And so essentially, our analogy is transferred to that situation. So we would say the intent behind those, and I think managers and people who design websites and e-commerce sites, the intent there is to one, that maybe they're mandated to provide those
Is
kinds
that
of
the GDPR or
disclosures.
GP? I can never remember the exact, but in
Right,
Europe
Europe.
forces that. Yes.
Yep, Europe's GDPR, and then California has their
Oh, that's
own.
right.
And at this point, there might be all other states that have individual mandates. So yeah, and so sometimes those things are mandated, but other times, firms, in an effort to be maybe transparent, and we've seen in other research that transparency is usually a good thing. You want to tell people what you're up to, and they usually appreciate those kinds of things. Um, so yeah, maybe the intent there is to make consumers feel better about their privacy. And sometimes they even do things. But one of the things that we've noticed, and we could chat about
Sure.
that, is that they talk about how good they are at protecting privacy, right? Their competence, and like using all of these encryptions and these things I don't understand, but the computer scientists who are really good at doing all the security measures. And ultimately, what happens is that raises consumers' concerns of privacy, and it may essentially it decreases their trust of the firm that is associated with that. And so the consequences there in the downstream is consumers are less likely to contract with the firm. They're less likely to purchase from those kinds of firms. They're less likely to sign up for mailers or any kind of those outcome variables that we might care about online, because of that privacy notice. And now it depends on sort of the way that you frame that privacy notice, but because of that privacy notice, the sort of initial effect is that now I'm starting to think about my privacy, and that gives me a little bit of a pause to sort of think, is this the right thing to be doing?
Yeah. Oh, wait, I am sharing this. Right. So, and it is so
Yeah.
funny. And I think some of it is too just an annoyance thing, because you normally have to click some kind of affirmation, and people do not like clicking. They like scrolling.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this comes from my own experience as a digital marketer. So, people go on a website, and everyone sees it now because it's now legally required in a lot of places that accept our cookies, don't accept our cookies.
Yes.
And so the response is often, what, I don't need to be on here, because it does give them a new decision moment, instead of to just proceed into the site, just to like stop, and then also to be like, oh yeah, what
Yeah.
are they doing with my privacy? Whereas like if you had an unethical business, We had a client. I don't think they did this out of malintent, but they did ask us. They're like, "Can you just like take people's email address from here and just put it in my newsletter?" And I was like, "No, no, can't do that." I think they just didn't know
Right.
about like the laws and stuff like that. But I know that there are people who probably still do that, right? Like it's hard to catch all that,
Oh
and
yeah.
so which is unethical, which is way worse for people's privacy. But because it's not listed, people probably trust them more, which is an odd thing.
Right.
Um, so it,
There was a really cool paper.
no,
Sorry, I
no,
didn't
go
mean
ahead.
to interrupt you there, but there was a really cool paper I was just reading about. It's because you mentioned this idea of like clicking. I feel like it's that when I was growing up, it was that turnstile when you're going on the roller coaster and you're standing in line and you made it through the turnstile to get to the roller coaster. I was a little afraid of maybe an anxious child. Um, and once you got through the turnstile, there was almost like no turning back. Like that
Yes,
meant that you were going to actually ride the
yes,
ride, and and so in that way, it's kind of like that where you're clicking on the button, and it feels like I have made a choice, and maybe that choice is not reversible, and so maybe that's that feeling of oh no, what have I
yes,
done, right? But yeah, anyways, thinking about that paper about the way that people differentially present those privacy options. And I'm gonna butcher this, but I think they were some folks out of Carnegie
mhm,
Mellon, and they were looking at like Android and Apple, and when they talk about privacy settings, then people are actually okay. They're actually thinking about privacy and making those self-protective kinds of elections. But then if you asked, it framed it as like location settings, which is essentially the same
yes,
thing.
yeah.
Are you allowing people to know where you are at any given moment of time? That's a pretty
Oh, yeah,
invasive, sensitive piece of information. But if you just called it something like location settings, then people are like, oh, sure. What difference does it make? So it's so like some subtle things that firms are doing, and do they know better? I don't necessarily know. These firms that are making these choices, maybe they do, but yeah, they do have some really interesting behavioral effects on people and their willingness to share some pretty sensitive information.
yeah. One thing that I've seen that I actually really appreciate, and is it always followed through on? I don't know. This Amazon thing coming out about Alexa listening even when it's not supposed to be. Like
Mm-hmm.
that there are people who are doing things they're not supposed to, even though they say they're not. Um, but the request to only I saw this option added about a year or two ago. Only allow while using the app, because
Oh, okay.
it used to be allow you either it was on or off, and which is
Yeah.
the fact that you like could have an app sitting on your phone and you just forget about it and not use it, and they just get all your information, all your location
Yeah.
is crazy. Versus like, I mean, obviously when I'm on Google Maps, like I want that to know where I am, right? But I don't know
Sure.
that
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want Google to know where I am all the time. And so that's a totally it's a totally different thing. But that to me seemed like a solution where just by providing that other option, and they made that the default option, which, as I'm sure you know, with marketing research, like the default option is actually a very important thing. Um,
Yeah. Absolutely.
but you mentioned, and I'd love for you to talk about this. So we have people who are frustrated with data privacy notices, or they see it as, oh, it makes them think about it, makes them distrust the company. You said there are some ways to mitigate that, though. How do you mitigate that distrustfulness that's created by the privacy notice?
Yeah. Good question. So one thing that we did, if I could just back up just a
Sure.
little bit, in our study, we wanted to know kind of how pervasive this was. So what we did was we had basically like how bad is this effect? How is it? What's the baseline kind of rate here? And so we pulled just 50 random privacy notices from some firms on, I think they were traded on one of the exchanges, so NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, something like that. And we looked through, we did some text analysis of their privacy, their actual privacy notices. And we looked at the type of language that they would use in terms of how they're talking about what they're doing with your data and what they're doing to protect it, et cetera. And so the baseline is that most people, and this will be important when we talk about how to mitigate this, most people, firms will talk about cognitive kinds of aspects of their privacy notice. So they're very cognitive as a contrast to affective. So cognitive is sort of thoughts, affective is sort of emotions and that kind of. So cognitive, and so very thought driven, very brain heavy, right? And so to answer your original question is about how do you mitigate that? You have to build trust with your consumers, and the more they trust you, the more likely they're going to contract with your firm and buy things and all of those outcomes that we want. But they need to trust you, and really it's built on the relational kind of trust, like that emotional trust that it's not. So there's a couple of components of trust. One is, do I think that you're able to protect my data? Like, do you have the competence? So that's one aspect. And that's what I think that a lot of firms kind of default to.
Yes.
They want to tell consumers, hey, we've got these encryptions and we've got all this great software and we can put it in, 8 levels of, the cloud and all of these things. But and consumers are probably thinking, okay, fine. But what I really need to hear from you is I need to hear that you're motivated, that our relationship means something to you, and that you're motivated to protect me. So that it's less about the competence aspect and more about like what we call benevolence. So it's, do you actually care about me as a consumer? And so that's a long answer to your question, which was
it's a great answer.
How do you mitigate that? And how do you mitigate it is essentially to communicate to your consumers that you care about them. And so we called them, in our paper, we called them benevolence cues. And so it was just as small effect as saying, we care about your privacy, and here's the privacy notice, right? It's just a little kind of a blurb that says, we're really committed to protecting your privacy. So you're trying to engender this relationship kind of view, as opposed to, hey, we're really good at this.
Yes.
We've got the greatest scientists. Like, that doesn't seem to matter.
Right.
It's about, like, we're motivated. Like, we like you. And so those are the things that tend to matter.
In
terms of,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, in terms of lessening the sort of backfire effect of those notices.
Which seems to really, I think, reflect, at least on a relational level, how humans, what really matters for humans, right? Like, just because someone's good at their job doesn't mean that they're going to do a good job. Someone could be only medium at their job, but if they really care about me, that's going to matter more than, not that necessarily just because these firms use that language, but there are reasons that triggers like that, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we want to be, we have a lot of self-worth and we think we're great inherently. That's a psychological sort of truism. But we want other people to think that we're great too. And when we engage in relationships, and effectively that's what we're doing when we buy things from online firms, is we're either starting or continuing some sort of relationship. We want them to care about us. And so we're kind of building that relationship through trust.
Was there anything particular that you found particularly surprising about the study?
Yeah, I mean, we tried a variety of different things. I'm trying to think of probably the most interesting things that happened. Well, one thing is, when we thought, really what's going on is that when people are reading these privacy notices, that they're getting scared by the language. Like, the language is if you're like me, you see the privacy notice or the terms of and conditions and you skim it and you maybe have read a couple of words.
Right.
But so maybe that's what we were thinking originally, was that people are really just getting scared off by reading through all this. And this is just a bunch of jargon and that legalese, and I don't understand it. And I get scared because I am not familiar with the things that they're talking about. And so maybe that's the thing that's turning people off. And so we decided to say, well, what if we don't have them read anything? What if we just sort of indicate that there is a privacy policy? We don't even have to have you read it, but just knowing that there is a privacy policy, period, does that also show up? And the answer is yes. I mean, so we had people in a couple of different situations, one where there was a privacy policy, like it was pretty clear. There's a link, the little blue link that says, click on our privacy policy. And then another group of participants at our surveys didn't see that at all. And we, and then we had another situation maybe that where people actually saw the privacy policy and read the whole thing, et cetera. And so it really only matters that people are aware that there is some sort of policy. So if we cued them to think about it, right? We cue them to think about privacy. That's the thing.
Interesting.
It doesn't matter the content. It's just about, it's about that they know there's a policy and sort of how they encounter that policy. So if they encounter that policy with the expectation that the firm is being benevolent and the reason that they're showing me this policy is because they care about me, then that mitigates the effect.
Yeah, it reminds me. Same podcast that I heard about this study. They also covered one where companies with cute logos tended to face less backlash when they had a scandal. It's like
interesting. Yeah,
and it's the same kind of thing. It's like I don't know that actually means that the company is more ethical, but it does cue those things in our head. That's like, especially if it was more childish and cuter. Like they're like, oh, we should give them another chance. And so the way that psychology plays out in these large form interactions, do you see, are there any inherent weaknesses to that interaction between how we're kind of hardwired and how that's being played out in these big systems?
No, yeah. I mean, I teach a variety of marketing classes here at Ohio State, and one of the things that I tell people is marketing is about relationships. And so really, you all know the answers, right? And we as firms and managers and people who are driving business, we know what to do. We know the answers. We've been taught these things, since we were really young. It's like, be nice to people, treat people how you want to be treated. Listen to them. Those are just sort of basic fundamental kind of rules about being in a social, group.
And your students get bored when you say this. Yeah, they're like, yeah, we know. Yeah. And then they don't do it. And then they're like, why isn't it working?
And then they don't do it.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I do a fair amount of consulting with firms, and I go in and the old rule or the old adage I think about consultants is consultants are people that you pay to look at your watch and tell you what time it is.
I've never heard
and that's essentially true.
That's awesome.
They come in, look at your watch and tell you what time it is. That's essentially what I do is go in and I reteach things that people already know. But sometimes we need that reminder, right? That gentle nudge to say, oh, right, yes. Like I shouldn't call my customers names, or I should treat them well, right? I shouldn't insult their intelligence. I should, all of these things that we know inherently. but yeah, sometimes we just need a reminder for those things.
I'm sorry, and I know you can't share because it's a client, but did you actually have to tell them not to call their customers names? Does that ever actually happen?
No, I think I made that.
Oh, okay, got you. I've seen it.
Yeah. Well, and then we have sort of specific conditions or contexts where that might actually be better. So think about like Wendy's in the last several years has gotten a lot of notoriety for their Twitter account.
Yes.
Being very subversive, and they'll roast people. And so if that's part of your shtick, if that's part of your brand and identity, then those things might work.
Because it comes across as
you got to be
authentic.
Careful. Yeah.
Yes,
right?
but then you do have to be careful. Yeah, it could definitely backfire. No, I was thinking,
and it's one of those I was going to say humor. Humor is one of those things that we talk about a lot, right? We talk about advertising and oh, we want to have really hilarious ads, and those will get awareness and attention and engagement. But humor is incredibly subjective.
Yes.
And so what I find funny, a lot of people don't find funny. But and so you have to be really careful with some of those things.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny because we talked earlier that you've done some work with reviews, and that's where when you said don't call your customers names, and not in the Wendy's sense of like roasting, I have seen reviews and been like, well, I'm not going there because I've seen owners, normally smaller businesses, responding in harsh ways and very inappropriate ways. I think I'm really curious. What has been your study of reviews, and what has that revealed?
Ooh, so reviews I think are fascinating. It's typically, the olden days was we got information. We're consumers and we got information as passive recipients, right? The firm was in control of the message, and the firm told us information and what they wanted us to know about the product or the service or whatever. But reviews now has been this great thing, the web, that we have interactions with other consumers, right? The C2C kinds of interactions. And now we get reviews from other people who have actually used the product, and they don't have a vested interest probably in selling us the product, but they're just of their own free will telling us about their experiences with the product. And so it lends a lot of credibility to those kinds of reviews and that information transfer. Because why would Joe Sixpack say all these wonderful things about whatever, this pogo stick that he bought off of Amazon or something? Like, he has no motivation to, he doesn't get any kickbacks or anything. Now there is some interesting work that says if we have what's called, I think it's vicarious goal fulfillment. Like, I give you a recommendation for reading a book. I say, hey, PJ, you should read this book.
Yeah.
And then if you actually go and read the book, then it feels good to me to have actually facilitated your accomplishment of that goal. But yeah, I mean, in general, right? The review, these people are doing it. Although, now you look at Yelp and some of these other platforms where there is maybe a little bit of an incentive for people to provide reviews. You become like an expert reviewer. And I think they have like gold star reviewers and those kinds of things. So yeah, there's some interesting dynamics there in reviews that are fascinating. And people have talked a lot about really interesting stuff in reviews, like the effects, like the proximity of when the review was written. So if you see a review for a restaurant that was written 2 days ago, more influential than you see a similar review that was written 2 months ago. Well, I mean, that probably makes some sense. Okay, so this is more current and therefore maybe more credible. There's some cool research about the differences that result in reviews from people who write them on their mobile device. So presumably in the moment. Like, I am now currently at the restaurant versus somebody who had their meal and then went home and wrote it on a laptop or a desktop. So that's fascinating. They talk about the language that people use and the vividness of the review. Just really, really interesting work going on in all kinds of areas here.
Yeah, that sends my brain all sorts of different directions. But I do have a couple other questions for you. What are some of the practical problems facing us as a society when it comes to data privacy? And what do you see as maybe some better possible solutions?
Yeah, so I think it's a matter of trade-offs. My co-author, Leslie John, has some studies where she talks about one of the things we were talking about earlier about consumers' willingness to disclose a lot of sensitive information. I find fascinating because consumers, and I forget this because I'm kind of entrenched in the world, but just the general everyday consumer doesn't quite understand the value of their information.
Yeah.
Right. Even things like location information or past purchase history or past search behavior, those things are incredibly, incredibly valuable to firms. Because even if I can incrementally go, essentially what firms are looking at is your probability. What's the likelihood that you are going to buy this widget? And if I can increase that probability even incrementally, like maybe I take you from a 50% to a 60% likelihood, that can be incredibly lucrative,
Yes.
right? Financially valuable to
especially
folks.
at scale.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of transactions, online. And so knowing that information is incredibly valuable to firms, it means that their costs are lower, right? They have fewer misses, I guess, is sort of the result. And so what I find fascinating is that consumers don't necessarily realize that information about them is so valuable. And so they give it up relatively freely. And so I mentioned my co-author, Leslie. She had some interesting studies about people, and I'm going to butcher the studies, but willing to give up pretty sensitive information for relatively minor kind of gifts, like maybe even a cookie. Like would you take a cookie for your social security number and your driver's license? Or just,
no.
I mean, these are things that really, I mean, and it's surprising that and so I think the thing that is happening, the trend is happening, is that consumers are starting to get more aware of the value of their information, and a lot more firms are realizing that people should have control of what information that they share, when they share it, whether or not they can retract that information, and so a lot of really good firms who are aware of these kinds of things are making sure that consumers have autonomy over their information and when that information gets shared. And I don't think we're at a point yet where the firms there's this massive asymmetry of information where firms know about the value of this information, but consumers don't. So we aren't quite to a point where it's equitable. Like, firms are giving up things. So you could argue that a firm, because they have all this great and rich information about you, that they're producing better products and services. So now I can produce this really customized thing that's just for you, that really targets your wants and needs, but it's not quite equitable by a long shot, I think. And I think it's certainly moving in that direction. And as consumers become more aware of the value of their information, they will start to demand more for in that exchange, right? I'm giving you valuable data. You need to give me something of value in return.
Yeah, I think it was.
So that's one thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago that the value of data of private data exceeded the value of oil, which is not surprising when you look at top companies like Amazon, Google, and I mean that all comes from very targeted advertising. And it is interesting because people will complain about that, and then at the same time they'll be like, man, I love these recommendations from YouTube, or I love these recommendations on Amazon for these things I want to buy. My YouTube algorithm, I sometimes switch accounts for different reasons, and then I'll be like, what is this? Like scrolling through the feed, and it's like, it's not used to me, and I see all this stuff, and then you forget how much you've given out there just by what I watch. And even through creating this podcast, recognizing how much information I get about my viewers is really, really astonishing. I did.
The other thing I'll say about that is that there is, this sounds like I'm going to be defending firms, and I don't want to sound that way, but there is some value in them using that information to generate things. So you mentioned your YouTube playlist. What else you would be spending, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's trivial, but some amount of time and some amount of effort of finding the next interesting video to watch. And so by using your data and the algorithm and the predictive software, they can suggest some things that they think you will find interesting or useful, or in Amazon's case, products that you will find that other people have found useful that purchased similar kinds of products. And so that is valuable to consumers. It's certainly not, it's not costless for you to go and search for, a variety of products. And so, yeah, in some ways it's valuable.
Well, it's interesting too. I just realized that I actually get information back because there are things I wouldn't have realized or known about unless they were actually some small way sharing other people's information with me.
That's right.
Because
I thought you were going to
go ahead.
I thought you were going to go down the road of you get information back about your own identity.
That
and
too.
That's true
yes,
too.
That's also true.
Right. Yeah. A colleague of mine here at Ohio State has done some work on that. You learn about yourself based on the recommendations that are given to you. You think, oh gosh, yeah, I am, kind of a crazy, dark humored kind of person, like because I'm getting all these, horror movie recommendations or whatever. Right. You learn a little bit about yourself.
There's that infamous Target study about how they were able to I still the
predictive
the pregnancy where the dad came in was yelling at the store and then apologized a week later. He found out that's how he found out his daughter was pregnant, was through advertising from Target.
Right. Yeah, they sent her some neonatal coupons for vitamins and things like that. They knew before he did, which was amazing.
Yes, yes. Also a little scary, right? And that's where there's that back and forth of it's just by what you buy, and when you put that together, because I think it's people look at you give away a lot of information about yourself, but when everyone's giving away a lot of information about themselves, the aggregate of that information is astonishingly powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and you're right. In some ways, if you are the only person, that really, really characterizes you.
Yeah.
But if you're part of a bigger group, then you can kind of blend in, camouflage yourself a little bit.
That's true too,
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did want, I have found that good questions often come from things that people get frustrated with. So you mentioned that you sometimes get frustrated talking to your students about marketing is more than advertising. So tell me a little bit about why marketing is more than advertising.
Oh, wow. Okay. So maybe I could characterize it in this way. So I have a textbook that I usually teach from. I think it's on the order of maybe 26, 27 chapters, maybe 30 chapters. I think there are 2 devoted to specifically advertising.
Wow.
So, and the intuition is that, because it's what we see, right? We all see advertising. We see ads in the subway, we see ads on TV and on the internet, banner ads, all kinds of things. That's what we see. It's accessible. But what we don't really see is all of the steps that kind of lead up to the production of that advertisement. And so that is the way that marketers that's what we would classify as marketing. All of the pre-work, what most people see is, this is a really terrible ad. I don't find this funny. Or this is a really great ad. It moved me. And so people are like, oh, advertising is marketing. That's so great. But there are probably hours and hours and hours of work that led up to the production of that advertisement. And that is what we would classify as marketing. So there's, the classic segmentation, targeting, and positioning, dividing the market up into homogenous groups of people and saying, okay, these people, the soccer moms, are really likely to behave similarly and different from, the goth people, right? Yeah. So, well, I don't know, maybe there's a goth soccer ball that they would both equally like. I don't know what that would look like, but yeah, right? So you've got groups of people. And so that's all marketing, right? It's about understanding consumers and picking the right consumers, saying we as a firm are really good at producing, eco-friendly products. And so maybe we shouldn't engage in relationships with people who they go out and want to club baby seals and things, right? Those aren't people that we mesh with, right?
Yeah, that would make sense. Yes.
Yeah, but all that's all marketing, right? That's all understanding of our consumers and the marketplace and positioning ourselves Yeah.
Is that so? This is a stab in the dark. Do you ever run into students who have over romanticized marketing because of like Mad Men, kind of like they want to be the next Don Draper type of thing? Is that part of what's we're discussing here, or
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think some of my favorite, I say that in, I should say in air quotes, my favorite moments with students is um, when we actually get into advertising or we do something that's relatively creative. And then they come and say, this is really great that we finally got to do marketing. And it typically is, if we're in a 16-week
yes,
semester, it's week
yes,
15 when we start talking about it. And I'm thinking, where have you been for the last 14 weeks? We've been doing marketing. Um, so yeah, oddly enough, I have never seen Mad Men. It of course gets recommended to
oh,
me
yeah,
a lot, but I'm sure I would love it. I'm sure it's fascinating. And the world of advertising and I don't mean to denigrate
right, right,
advertising.
right.
It's a great industry, and those people are amazingly creative. Um, and yeah, I mean, obviously, advertising, as we began our conversation, was the thing that kind of drew me into the world of marketing. But yeah, it's certainly not everything.
Mm,
And so you've got people who are interested in marketing. I mean, I often tell my students things like, it doesn't matter. So sometimes they'll be afraid of either statistics or analytics or some of these other more technical skills like that. There's still a place for you in
yeah,
marketing. If you can talk to people. I mean, marketing is about starting relationships and building those relationships. So if you're good at that, you're good at marketing.
mm. Is there is there a divide, or maybe a perceived divide, between ethical and effective marketing?
Mm. Um, so I would say that there's maybe a perceived divide. Um, there has been a host of research in the last 10 years that talks about um, doing the phrase that they use is doing good as opposed to doing well.
Mm,
So doing good meaning like pro-social kinds of activity as a firm. Maybe you've got corporate social responsibility initiatives. We're doing green initiatives, recycling, good for the planet. Look at the triple bottom line versus doing well, which typically means financially.
right.
You're healthy as an organization, and you're going to financially make it. And so that used to be the perception that you couldn't have both of those, that they were mutually exclusive. That if you really wanted to do well
Yeah,
financially, you had to screw over somebody,
yeah.
right? Maybe it was the earth, or maybe it was your consumers. But now there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that actually, and maybe it's because of society has sort of
Mm,
shifted, that consumers really want and respect firms that are pro-social, that engage in environmentally healthy behaviors. Things like fair trade. You think about like the coffee
sure.
industry. Paying people what they're worth. All of those things are really seen as consumers. And certainly we talked about segments, the soccer moms and the goths. There are certain segments of consumers that will seek out firms that are intentionally doing good things,
Mm.
right? So, and I think those segments are getting bigger as we see the importance of people's politics and other things. Their values shape the way that they buy, and I think people can think about their voice using their wallets as their voice. So,
Uh, so forgive me. I don't. What's the triple bottom line?
oh gosh, now you're putting me on
Oh,
the
yeah.
spot.
Sorry.
Um, it is, I think it's corporate. So shareholders is
Okay.
one bottom line. So that's sort of the
Yeah.
financial, and I think it's society is another. So we should be beholden to shareholders, which is pretty
Sure.
typical. Society, and then I think maybe it's the environment. I
Yeah.
think it might be the third one. But essentially, yeah, we need to be thinking about, as a firm, we need to be thinking about our impact beyond just making money.
Yes,
Right?
gotcha.
We have to
Sorry for putting you on the
contribute
spot.
something
Yeah.
else. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can edit it. I can go in and actually look, and then you can edit it in and say, "Oh man, this guy knows everything."
No, that is, I'd put you on the spot there. Actually, I have to know now. The social and environmental and profits. You're right on. See, you do
Oh,
know
right.
everything. The
Terrific.
no, that's and I think everyone understands whether it was social or environmental or a couple other things like that. The main idea that companies can look beyond, and I think that's really important. So I'm definitely going to steal that concept. So thank you.
Yeah.
So kind of as we close out here for our listeners, if you could leave them with one thing about their power as a consumer and how they should, what they should take away from your studies with data privacy, what would you leave them with?
That's a good question. So I would say, um, first, their power as a consumer and their control over their data. One, it's getting better. So there's good news on the horizon that firms are starting to realize that they need to give over more control to consumers, whether that is mandated through legislation and regulation, or simply that they are trying to influence consumers' desire to contract with them. So that's the good news. The thing I would say is that consumers, the answer is almost always that you should educate yourselves. But I get it that it's hard. It's hard to be informed of everything.
Right.
And so to make yourself, there's a strong push, and it's been a strong push in our academic world for probably the last 15, 20 years about making sure that the research that we do is helping not just firms, but consumers to be better consumers. And so oftentimes it's just merely awareness of, what's going on, your own psychology about like how you interpret information, whether that's, reviews online or, the privacy that is presented to you, privacy notices that are presented to you. So being aware of your own kind of reactions is a really important thing as a consumer. And the more you are, the more you'll notice the way that you behave in certain situations and contexts and things. And so one of the good things that you can do is sort of build up your own history, like a mental diary of, the last time I was in this situation, I did something that was maybe suboptimal or didn't work out to my advantage, and so maybe I'll try something different, or maybe I'll remember that, and then the next time I can maybe make a better choice around something. But I do think a lot of what we do as consumer psychologists is with the intent of making consumers better choice makers, make better decision makers, because these have some pretty major consequences, either financial consequences or the amount of information that you're giving over to people that you maybe didn't want to give over. So and I think part of that is being more educated as a that's easy for me to say because that's my job.
Right.
But yeah, there are a few things that you can do and understand as a consumer about the way that you make choices that are important.
Yeah, it's like starting with not trading your social security for a cookie, something like
For a cookie. Right. Or just small things. I mean, those matter. I mean, the difference between like the value of your information and what people are giving over to you is very, very different.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Sure.
And thank you for coming on. Is there anything that you'd like to plug here at the end?
I have no things to plug. I am plugless. I should know better, right? As a marketing professor.
Well, we'll definitely put a link to the study if people want to know more.
Please, take a look. It's in coming forthcoming in the Journal of Marketing Research. And it's, check out all of my co-authors' research, all of my research. If you're interested in privacy, identity formation, those kinds of things, we're a great team of people that are fascinated by this stuff.
Yeah.
So we like talking about it.
Yeah, well, and your passion definitely comes through. So thank you again for coming on.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks very much.